This is the second video about democratic autonomy. Now, the theorist Robert Dahl returns from Chapter 6 on classic and neopluralism to be included in Held's discussions about what is needed for this model of democratic autonomy. And so Held includes Dahl's list of the five minimum conditions for democracy. This is on page 271. And this list provides some criteria for understanding what is needed for an effective model of democracy. These conditions are necessary for truly democratic decision-making to occur. The first one is effective participation. So this means that citizens must have an adequate and equal opportunity to form their own preferences, place questions on the public agenda, and to express reasons for choosing one outcome rather than another. Now, this condition is necessary in order to ensure that no group is marginalized by this democratic process. The second criteria is enlightened understanding. Here, citizens must enjoy ample and equal opportunities for discovering and affirming what choice in a matter that's presented to them would best serve their interests. So here, an accessible education system might be important in building understanding. The third one is about voting equality at a decisive stage. So citizens must know that they are able to express their judgment and that their judgment will be counted as equal in weight to the judgments of other citizens at a point in the collective decision-making process where it matters. It can't be just an afterthought. The fourth point is about control of the agenda. So the people must have the opportunity to make decisions as to what is important, what matters should and should not be decided by processes that meet those first three criteria. And then the fifth criteria is about inclusiveness. So there needs to be powers of citizenship provided to all mature persons who have a legitimate stake in the polity. So, visitors to a country could be exempted, or people that are just passing through could be exempted. But anybody that lives in a society should be included in this decision-making power. Now, Held goes through a number of the weaknesses of some of the previous models discussed earlier in the textbook to conclude that there are two main problems. The first problem is that the structures of civil society do not create the conditions that are needed for equal votes, effective participation in deliberation, proper political understanding, and equal control of the political agenda. So he's saying that the structures of civil society, including things like sexual and racial inequalities, as well as the current forms of property ownership and wealth, are the things that mean that we do not have the conditions for truly equal votes and truly effective participation in deliberation and so on. The second problem is related, and it's that the structures of liberal democratic state do not create the necessary organizational force that can regulate civil power centers. So this means that structures like, having politicians who are only concerned about their reelection, having bureaucratic apparatuses that are not really accountable to the people, or when we depend too much on a private capital accumulation to keep the economy going, and so on. If those things are part of the liberal democratic state, then we don't have the necessary force to really regulate power in our society. Now, the implications of these problems is that democracy has to be considered in terms of, first, the reform of state power, and second, the restructuring of civil society. So he talks about the principle of autonomy needing to have a double-sided democratization, which means there needs to be an independent transformation of both the state and civil society. So it needs to have both things happening. We need to have a democratic autonomy, also called liberal socialism. Now, this process of double democratization, alongside the enactment of the principle of autonomy, leads to this model. It leads to a model of state and society that is intended to enhance the choices and benefits which flow from living in a society that does not leave large categories of people in subordinate positions or at the mercy of forces entirely out of their control. Now, the aim of democratic autonomy is to give, to make real the ideal of the active citizen and to create greater fluidity and accountability of political power. Now, Held discusses the features of this model in terms of questions. So he asks questions, is participation an obligation? What is the private sphere? Who should deliberate and govern? How should the market be reframed? Will this model result in a tyranny of sameness? Should autonomy be limited in this model? And finally, would democratic autonomy really create political legitimacy? So he starts, of course, with his principle of justification, which we've reviewed already. So this idea that people need to be able to enjoy both equal rights and equal obligations in any kind of political framework. So they need to be free and equal in the processes of deliberation about the conditions of their own life and in the determination of these conditions, as long as these things aren't used to harm other people, to negate the rights of other people. So we have the key features, what this model would look like in terms of the state, and then what it would look like for the civil society. And he asks questions, as I said, about things like, is participation an obligation? And he says that by enshrining the principle of autonomy in a constitution and in a Bill of Rights, the rights of all citizens to participate is protected without requiring participation, which would undermine autonomy. So people have the right to participate, but they are not obligated to. And this would be different from some models of deliberative democracy, which required people to take part in deliberation. So you may have seen some discussions about people being fined if they don't vote, for example. Now, there would be some obligations. For example, citizens would be obliged to accept the decisions unless their rights were being violated by the decision. So even if they don't participate, they have to accept the decisions that are made. Some of this is connected to things like the parliamentary or congressional structure that might be organized around two chambers based on proportional representation. That's what the PR stands for, and so on. There would also be, judicial systems that might include specialized representation for a test of the interpretation of rights. I think there's a typo in there. But you can see it in the textbook, this model of democracy. And then there's this competitive party system that might be, and we'll talk about this in a second, it would be reconstituted through things like public funding and deliberative participation. And then we could be talking about how, this is about how we decide who deliberates and governs. So I mentioned that there's that question of what is the private sphere? He does say that there needs to be more discussion and theoretical inquiry about what constitutes the private sphere versus the public sphere, or as Hal calls it in the textbook, the sphere of the intimate. And we need to have more clarity about the boundary between the public and the private. And Hal really doesn't go into this too much. Number 3 was the question of who should deliberate and govern. Held does say that it might be possible to have a range of democratic processes coexisting with more participatory forms of democracy in smaller communities and workplaces, and a form of proportional representation in larger areas. And Held discusses some of these possibilities, like such as a type of party-based deliberative direct democracy in which the electorate could choose among competing parties for office and still act like a parliamentary assembly. And so the parties would propose policies, and then citizens would be part of this assembly that would deliberate on the policies proposed by the politicians, for example. We mentioned about the question of how should the market be reframed. So if we think about the idea that the economy, we need to have a new way of thinking about the economy, because we need to think about how corporations and other orders of production could be integrated into this model of democratic autonomy. So, for example, they would need to commit to upholding the requirements of democratic autonomy. But Hal does question, he raised questions about what form of ownership is the best. And these forms of ownership have ranged from private ownership to public ownership to cooperative ownership or to some combination of these things. He also raises the question of whether or not this model would result in a tyranny of the sameness. Um, and he says, no, it doesn't have to. And he says that we can still have a diversity of types of households and sources of information and cultural institutions and consumer groups and so on. But this is a question that a lot of people will raise when you talk about trying to level the playing field or trying to redistribute wealth and power in order to improve the lives of people who are the least powerful. And he suggests that we should be able to ensure that large numbers of people are not always left behind or left at the mercy of forces beyond their control. And we can think here of what's happening today with the COVID-19 outbreak. What's happening to the people that are living or working in homeless shelters, for example? Should we not be looking at redistributing the wealth so that we can make sure that nobody is decimated by this virus? We can also look at how things like community services such as childcare and healthcare centers and education, how these things should be organized, how they should be funded, and they can include elements of democratic participation or deliberative processes by setting some priorities. We also need to have room for development and experimentation with different types of managing things. And so, these raise questions around how should autonomy exist? Should autonomy be limited in this model? Because in most political systems, there are always some kinds of limits to the extent of liberty that people can enjoy. So in this model, there's a basic commitment to the principle that the liberty of some people must not come at the expense of other people. So in this sense, some people will no longer be able to pollute the environment of other people or to accumulate vast unregulated resources and so on. But this doesn't mean that there's an end to the division of labor or to specialized expertise, for example. Again, it's about a rethinking of how we have traditionally done things so that we don't leave a large number of people as disadvantaged in order to privilege a few people. We can also ask the question about whether or not democratic autonomy would create political legitimacy. Now, here, Held is a bit uncertain because he says that the model is basically a thought experiment, and he thinks it probably would create legitimacy because it would be based on more egalitarian measures. Now, throughout this model, Held believes that collective action by the state is needed in order to legislate for and enforce the constitutional rights that he imagines we would have, as well as for intervening on behalf of citizens in areas that cannot be left to individualism in the market, such as public health. Held adds economic rights to the political rights of citizens, and he adds a redistributive function to the rule of law. And he argues that there has to be a meaningful level of income where citizens cannot effectively participate or be heard, let alone have an equal share in determining the conditions of his or her existence. So, what are the general conditions that are needed for the model of democratic autonomy? These are kind of fairly self-explanatory. The first one is we need to have open and free information, whether this comes through education or free press or open access to the internet. We need to make sure that people have access to high quality information that will help them to make informed decisions. We also need to make sure that there are the tools are available to us to ensure that people are fully able to participate in public affairs. So we need to have these deliberative democratic mechanisms and procedures for these things to work. The third point is particularly relevant given the ongoing situation today and its impact on the economy. The article assigned for this week by Barger on the economic crisis and changes to Canada's economic policy as relevant. And both Held and Barger make the argument for strong economic regulations to be put in place by the government. We'll talk more about that in a separate video. Also related and relevant to today is the next point on the need for rules governing labor. We need rules that govern labor, that govern welfare, that govern health, and that govern the environment with regards to how corporations operate. It's in crises such as what we are seeing today and what we saw in 2008, 2009 that illustrates the need for regulations to protect the workers. And then the final 2 points are about making sure that power cannot be abused and that governments do not get stuck in ruts. For instance, Canadians have been talking about the need for electoral reform for quite a while, and Prime Minister Trudeau's first platform when he ran for Prime Minister the first time round included a promise of electoral reform, and yet very few governments at any level in Canada have actually followed through on electoral reform. Now, as mentioned at the start of this video, democratic autonomy is the first part of Held's proposed democratic reform. Next week's lecture is on the second part, which is cosmopolitan democracy, which focuses on the international and regional context. Now, I'm going to continue this discussion of democratic autonomy, focusing on the 2 articles that were assigned in a separate video.